So I think we're rolling now. Mr. Saad, welcome to our podcast.
Oh, very nice to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I was just asking you, what is your title really? Because I've written down doctor in evolutionary psychology, but you were correcting me already. So maybe you can tell our audience what your degree really is.
Well, it certainly is that much of my scientific career has been in evolutionary psychology, and I've done enough work in evolutionary psychology to have many doctorates in evolutionary psychology. But officially, my degree is in, so my doctoral dissertation was in psychology of decision making. Specifically, I looked at how much information do people look at before they commit to a choice. So let's say I'm choosing between two women to marry, or two cars to purchase, or two politicians to vote for. Well, I could look at, let's say, 50 different attributes on those two candidates, but I don't. At some point, after I've seen 6, 7, 10, 12 attributes, I will say, I'm going to stop further acquisition of information, and I'm going to commit to buying the Mazda, to marry Linda, to vote for whomever. And so what I looked at in my doctoral dissertation was the cognitive strategies that we use when we are implementing the stopping decision, which of course is a very relevant mechanism to understand across any decision that we make. And that's why I actually have applied this model both to explain consumer choice, but also to explain mate choice. When is it that men and women have seen enough information to stop and choose this person or reject both partners? So that was my doctoral dissertation. The way that I got into evolutionary psychology, which was actually in my first semester in my PhD, was I had taken an advanced social psychology course with a gentleman by the name of Professor Dennis Regan. And about halfway through the semester, he assigned a book by two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, a husband and wife team, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson. And the book was titled Homicide. And that's the book that turned me into an evolutionary psychologist, because in the book, they offered the lens of evolutionary theory to explain patterns of criminality around the world across time periods. In other words, certain types of crime, whether it's 500 years ago, whether it's 500 years from now, whether it's in the Amazon jungle or it's in Detroit, Michigan, are going to happen for exactly the same reasons. And the reason why it's the same reason that drives these is because of certain underpinning biological mechanisms. And so that was really my epiphany. I decided that I would take this evolutionary framework and apply it to decision-making and consumer choice. And so that's kind of the background of my scientific training.
Right. And that resulted in two excellent books, namely The Consuming Instinct. I love the subtitle. It's very grabbing. What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, pornography, and gift-giving reveal about human nature. Well, that's something I would like to discuss. And of course, your last book, is The Parasitic Mind, which I think is very relevant, which is about how infectious ideas are killing common sense. And that's something we've noticed in Holland as well. Sense making is difficult nowadays. And maybe we can speak to that a little as well. The main reason for me wanting to talk to you is to expose my audience, which is very focused on personal development, mental growth, health, vitality, getting stuff done, about the basics of evolutionary psychology, because I think that having an awareness on those can help you understand why you need to modify certain behavior or why you see yourself doing certain things, and understanding that allows you to maybe tweak it. So that will be a desired outcome for today. And maybe we can start at the very beginning, namely, what is evolutionary psychology?
Yes. Okay. Well, I could probably spend 4 hours explaining that. I'll try to condense into a few minutes.
Sure.
Look, evolutionary psychology is simply the application of the framework of evolution to study the most important organ that defines our personhood, which is the human mind, right? So in the same way that I can use evolution to explain why our kidneys function the way that they do, or why we have opposable thumbs, I can, of course, use the theory of evolution to explain why this human mind of mine and yours has evolved to be the way it is, why it has the emotional system that it has, the perceptual system, the motivational system, the cognitive system, the behavioral system. All of these systems did not evolve out of magic. They didn't come through what typically social scientists say, it's due to culture, it's due to learning, it's due to socialization. Even if that were true, it would still beg the question, why is learning of that form? Why is socialization of that form? Why do certain cultural forms take the shape that they take? They're not due to something outside of biology. They're due to biological imperatives. So evolution, so that's the first thing. The second thing I would say about evolutionary psychology is that evolutionary psychologists recognize that the human mind is made up of two distinct sets of systems. So they are what are called domain general mechanisms and domain specific mechanisms. Intelligence is a domain general mechanism because intelligence is a key that I can use in many different domains. I can use it to do well on my calculus exam. I could use it to be funny in the mating market. I could use it to aspire to be a good politician. Intelligence is a general key that could be used across many domains. Domain specific mechanisms, though, is what evolutionary psychology adds to our understanding of the human mind. Because what a domain-specific computational system says is that in the same way that our pancreas and our liver and our heart have each evolved to solve specific problems, the human mind is an amalgamation of computational systems, each of which has evolved to solve a specific adaptive problem. So, for example, find mate, retain mate, avoid predators, build coalitions, build friendships, invest in kin, avoid, poisonous foods or toxic foods. Each of these evolutionarily recurrent problems would have necessitated the evolution of specific computational systems that are exactly armed to solve that problem. And so this is why evolutionary psychologists talk about the human mind being like a Swiss Army knife, because that's a very apt metaphor, because the Swiss Army knife consists of different blades, each of which is not transferable to another domain, right? The blade that takes out the cork from the wine bottle cannot be used to cut the camembert cheese. You have to use different blades for different purposes. So those are two of the fundamental tenets of EP. Maybe I'll add one more. Most social scientists are what's called social constructivists. They think that everything due is to social construction, which inherently means that the human mind, according to them, is tabula rasa, empty slate. We are born with empty minds, and it's only through the forces of socialization that we learn to prefer a certain type of man or a certain type of woman or certain types of food. It's only socialization. There is no biological imperatives. And of course, evolutionary psychologists say, of course, socialization matters, but there are innate biological blueprints which we come to the world with. So one quick example, and then I'll cede the floor back to you. Facial symmetry is an evolved marker of beauty that, of course, many people will say, well, that's just a social construction. We just learn through advertisements to prefer these types of faces, which is, of course, complete nonsense, because those images exist in their form because they cater to innate preferences. Now, how would we demonstrate that something is an innate preference? Well, you could take children who are too young to be socialized. So by definition, they haven't yet reached the cognitive developmental stage to be socialized. And we can show that those children already exhibit an innate preference for facial symmetry, for people who hold facially symmetric faces. And so therefore, there are very, very clear and elegant ways to demonstrate that we are hardly tabula rasa. We are born into the world with certain biological imperatives.
Interesting. A question I had about that, but I anticipated a little later, but maybe I can jump to it, is when it comes to these things, I can imagine a certain set of things being sort of hardwired into the psychology. However, is there also a part of that sexual selection, those markers, that is more fluid? For example, that changes over time, certain things that used to be things that would get you a mate now aren't anymore, and other things will take those places?
So changes over time is a separate question. Let me answer the first part of your question, which is fluidity. So the fancy term would be behavioral plasticity, right? The idea is that we have evolved as an adaptation the capacity to be adaptable in vivo, meaning, for example, if you look at patterns of spice use around the world, right? So that would be a cultural trait, right? The Mexicans have spicy food. The Dutch don't have spicy food. And so if you were a cultural anthropologist or a cultural psychologist, your story would end there. You have identified a cultural difference, and that's it. Good night, everyone. Whereas what an evolutionary psychologist would do, in this case, what's called a behavioral ecologist, and I'm going to speak to your malleability and fluidity in a second. They would ask the question, why have cultural traditions, when it comes to cuisine, evolved such that some cultures have spicy food and others don't have spicy food? And the answer to that is, it turns out that what predicts the extent of spice use is the ambient temperature in that society. Hotter climates make greater use of spices, hot spices. Now, why would that be? Well, because in hot climates, you have a greater density of pathogenic load, and the proliferation of foodborne pathogens is much quicker. Therefore, the cultural tradition of using spices, spicy foods, becomes a cultural adaptation to a biological problem. And that speaks exactly to your original question, which is, depending on the ecosystem in which I reside, I will either be more spicy or less spicy. So now let me give you even a more fundamental demonstration of your question. The immune system itself is a demonstration of how adaptability is an adaptation. What do I mean by that? If the immune system had only evolved to kill pathogens P1, P2, and P3 and nothing else, in other words, it has 0 degrees of freedom, then we know that pathogens, one of their tricks is that they evolve and mutate very quickly. So if my immune system and yours could only kill P1, P2, P3, we'd all be dead right now, because as soon as P1 becomes P1 star or P1 asterisk, we're dead. Therefore, within the capacity of the immune system is built in the flexibility to adjust to new environments. So this is why I detest the idea by usually imbeciles who say things like evolutionary psychology is nothing more than biological determinism. I just gave you multiple examples that demonstrate that that's not true. It's always an interaction between our genes and environmental contingencies. That's why evolutionary psychologists talk about the interactionist view, genes interacting with the environment.
Interesting. The reason I was wondering this was because I was looking at the situation that we find ourselves in the world. It's very, let's say, for example, climate change, and let's assume that that is something that is life-threatening to us and maybe the next generation, or at least not sustainable. I was wondering how maybe if you want to change human behavior and you want to take the EP approach, then what I see going on is that if you look at the core Darwin drives, they're pushing on the survival button really hard. And I was wondering, maybe we could do something else. Maybe we could push on the procreation button a little more. So if we could make being green or being sustainable something that could get you laid, I think that the effect would be greater. My question is it possible for a society to have those selection markers change to something that might serve the greater good in this regard? So is that something that actually happens, or will we always be picking the macho dude with the Rolex and the big car?
So that speaks to the second part of your previous question, where you said, could things change? So, yes. So first, let me answer it theoretically in a general sense, and then I'll see if we could apply it to the green issue and climate change and so on. Depending on which trait we are talking about, evolution can operate on it within a few generations. For example, within a couple of 100 years, you can create an environment that selects for lactose tolerance, right? And as a matter of fact, there are very, very compelling studies in a field called gene culture coevolution that demonstrate that in cultures where you haven't had pastoral living, where you haven't raised livestock, you are much likely to have people who have lactose intolerance as a gene. In other words, they haven't evolved the ability to process properly, synthesize lactose. Okay. Now that can happen within a few generations. On the other hand, if you told me how many generations would it take for us to evolve from having 10 fingers to having 11, it's going to take a lot longer for that to happen. That's why these are now called fixed traits. They're part of the genotype. So it really depends on which trait you're talking about, from a couple of hundred years to many million years, if ever. Now, but more generally, your point, and then I'll come back to climate change, your point speaks to a very, very important concept in evolutionary medicine, which is known as the mismatch hypothesis. The mismatch hypothesis refers to the fact that we are a product of adaptations that were optimal in our ancestral past. If today the modern environment is incongruent with that other environment, then we have a mismatch, so that things that were adaptive then can become maladaptive today. And yet we don't have enough time to alter those things. It'll take selection pressures for another 100,000 years before these things change. And the classic example of that is our taste buds. So my gustatory preference and yours are such that even though you and I might have different preferences, what I can almost guarantee is that we both prefer some version of a high calorie food to raw celery. I may prefer a juicy steak. You may prefer, a fatty chocolate mousse, but we both prefer some fatty thing over raw carrots. And that makes perfect evolutionary sense, because the fundamental problem that all animals face, including the human animal, is not becoming someone's dinner and making sure to get dinner. And therefore, to the extent that we've evolved in an environment of caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty, then your ancestors or mine would have preferred to eat fatty foods than, tofu. But on the other hand, in today's environment, where we have removed the caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty environment, we now have an environment of plenitude. Well, then the top 9 killers are related to that mismatch hypothesis, whether it be diabetes or heart disease or colon cancer, the building of plaques in your arteries, as I mentioned. All of these are related to the incongruency between what was adaptive in our past and what is adaptive today. So that answers your question about, can things change evolutionarily speaking? Now, how do we link it to climate change is itself a very interesting question. There is a paper that this is not my paper, but that this is probably maybe 10 years ago. I can't remember the exact date. The paper was titled Green to be Seen, which speaks to your point about I want to be green so I can get laid. Because in this case, what I'm doing is, instead of engaging in status signaling, instead of me driving my Ferrari many times around the block so that the girls can see that I'm a hot guy, I am going to show that I am super green and I hug trees and I have posters of Greta Thunberg in my bedroom, because then I'm super green, right? So there is certainly research that shows that to some extent, the markers of status can change across time periods or across cultures, right? In our culture, it might be if I have an Ivy League degree or how many zeros I have in my bank. For the Hadza tribe in Africa, it might be how many heads of cattle they own. So while the markers of status may change across time and space, what doesn't change is that status is a much more important driver of behavior for men than it is for women. That hasn't changed, and I suspect it won't change anytime in the future.
So if you would want to solve the puzzle of changing behavior in that regard, that being more green should raise your status in everyone's eyes. So society should start holding those values in higher regard, and then it would start having an effect on behavior.
Yes, in an abstract sense, yes. Although I suspect that in the deep recesses of their sexual fantasies, women don't typically say, my goodness, if I could only be with a guy who cries when he watches Bridget Jones' Diary and he's got a foulard and he really cares about the tree. Now, by the way, I'm not denigrating the fact that we have to be, caring for the environment. But what I'm saying is that the prototype of what is desired in a man, it'll take a long time before women are driven to sexual frenzy because a guy is exhibiting great love for a salamander that's about to go extinct. That won't happen.
Yeah, no, I think I was thinking more along the lumberjack hunter lines myself when I was talking about this. So having a certain awareness, but I see what you're going for, and what you're saying is that these selection criteria are so deeply embedded that it's very hard to override those, or at least that will take a lot of time.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. I have a question about that, by the way.
Sure.
Do you think it's smart that we're losing, or no, let me preface that with another question. Am I right in assuming that it seems that there's a certain pressure on those things that we used to select for? So toxic masculinity is a thing right now. But I have a sense that it's still important. So like you said, symmetry, signals of testosterone are something that are still important in that selection, although there seems to be sort of a taboo on it right now. Am I correct in that?
So I actually wrote an article, I can't remember exactly when, maybe 3 years ago, and your listeners and viewers can go and check it out. I have a Psychology Today column, which I haven't written much in it recently, although I've got over 300 articles that I've written over the years in that column. One of the more recent ones, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it was a article that I wrote. I think it was titled, "Is Toxic Masculinity a Valid Concept?" And what I was arguing there is that, well, first of all, it's not usually a good idea in a sexually reproducing species involving two phenotypes, male and female, to pathologize half of that species, right? So it has now become inherently toxic, pathological to be masculine. Now, yes, of course, men are more likely to commit crime. Men are more likely to fight in wars, but also there are, the opposite side of the coin is that many of the great things that have happened in society are due to that, quote, toxic masculinity. The reality is that women don't fantasize about a guy who's toxic masculine in the sense that, he beats you with the head over a thing and he drags you to the cave. That's not what we're looking for. We are looking for a guy who is kind, who is sensitive, but who is strategic in to whom he meets that kindness, right? So he should go out into the world and be very brawny and be very dominant and ascend the social hierarchy, but while also being loving and kind and altruistic to those that he loves. So nobody is saying that women fantasize over, psychopathic, cavemen, but they certainly, the reason why, the many of the key archetypes that, we think about in female fantasy, the firefighter and the guy in the military suit, the reason why we fantasize over those if we're women is precisely because they are exhibiting those cues that some feminists will argue are toxic masculinity, whereas other women call it, that's my fantasy, right? So I think it's a combination of things. It's, I should be brawny, I should be intelligent, I should be socially dominant, but of course I should be kind.
And from an EP standpoint, why are these traits desirable?
Largely because they highly correlate with my capacity to obtain and defend resources. Now, resources doesn't necessarily just mean money. It means ascending whatever are the metrics for ascending the social hierarchy. So, for example, there's never been a woman who had, or let's say a culture where women have consistently said the following: here is what drives me into sexual frenzy. If a guy has a nasally voice, if he has an hourglass figure, if he whines and cries all day, if he plays video games in mom's basement, if he has no chance of ever having a job because he's got zero ambition, my God, please sign me up for this guy. I'm ready to have passionate animalistic sex with him right now. Right? So, but Picasso, who was not physically attractive, he was a short little guy. He was a balding guy. He wasn't very, physically dominant, but he was Picasso. He had a unique artistic ability. He had huge social status because he was this great painter. Well, guess what? there was a gigantic orderly queue of women waiting patiently to have sex with him. Had he not been Picasso, not a single one of those women would have given him a second of their time. So the reason why we go after those, quote, masculine traits is because men around the world seek certain traits in women. It's universal. Women around the world seek certain traits in men, and that's universal. And to the extent that those, quote, toxic masculine traits are desired by women, we're never going to select them out of our preferences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm afraid so too. We once had a guest in our studio. Perhaps you know him, Mark van Vught. He's
yes, I do.
Yeah, he wrote the book Mismatch, and he jokingly said, and this is something I would like to verify because it sounds so cynical. But he said, like, everything you do is sexual selection. Like, everything you do is sexual selection. And if I check in with myself, I have this very complex sense of experience of the world, which, of course, as a male is dominated by sexual thoughts. Let's not deny it, but it's not like 100% of the bandwidth being consumed. And I always wondered, is that an overstatement, or would you subscribe to that?
So it's a slight overstatement in that it's not all sexual selection. This is why, by the way, when you read, so this is a nice way to segue into, when you read the subtitle of The Consuming Instinct, mm-hmm. those examples, I chose them for very clear theoretical reasons. And so this is going to answer your question about sexual selection. So if you remember, in the subtitle is what juicy burgers, pornography, Ferraris, and gift giving reveal about human nature, right? Mm-hmm. Now, each of those examples speak to what I refer to as a basal Darwinian module. So one module is the survival module. That's the juicy burgers, right? So there are all sorts of things that we do, not only as consumers, just as human beings in general, that map very nicely to natural selection, right? So the instinct to survive. Then there is the Ferrari, and the pornography speak exactly to what Mark was mentioning, that it relates to, in some form or another, to a sexual selection, the mating drive. But then there are two other fundamental modules that I speak of. One is called kin selection, and one is called reciprocal altruism. So kin selection is the mechanism that explains altruistic acts between kin. So why would I jump into the river and save 3 of my children at the risk of me dying? If evolution only cared about the survival of the singular organism, as originally Darwin thought, then there is no reason for me to ever evolve kin-based altruism. But if we recognize that the unit of selection is at the gene level, then it makes perfect evolutionary sense for me to potentially die in the service of saving 3 of my children with whom I share on average half of my genes. So kin selection is another fundamental driver of human behavior. In the case of consumer behavior, I use it to explain, for example, patterns of gift giving. So that I've done several scientific studies where I've shown that, with some co-authors, where I've shown that people have an unbelievable, uncanny capacity to modulate the size of the gift that they give as a function of the genetic relatedness between them and the recipient, right? So on average, I'm much more likely to give a larger gift to my brother than I am to my second cousin, right? Now, it doesn't mean that people do this consciously, but that system, that computational system, is already built into us. And then the fourth Darwinian module is reciprocal altruism. Colloquially, that explains why I would jump into the river, not to save 3 children of mine, but to save Michael, who is a Dutch guy who's not biologically linked to me, or to jump in to save a friend who is also not my biological kin, right? So, and reciprocal altruism, the argument for why it would have evolved is that the mechanism of reciprocity is very important in social species because it oils our sociality, right? So imagine we are both my family and yours, even though we're not, our families are not related, we are walking around in the African savannah. Well, since we both face caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty, how about we strike up an insurance policy whereby if I bring down the 2,000 pound game, I will share it with you on the understanding that next time when we will be in a famine state, you will reciprocate, right? So when we see, for example, our primate cousins engaging in reciprocal grooming, what are they doing? I give you my back. You literally take out the parasites from my back on the understanding that then we will reciprocate. The other one will do it for the other, right? And therefore, you scratch my back, I scratch yours is literally a mechanism of reciprocity. So to answer in a big way, regarding what Mark said, yes, sexual selection is a fundamental driver of tons of stuff that we do, but it's not the only mechanism. I argue that there are 4 key fundamental drivers.
Yeah, I like that one a lot better because it's a little less cynical. However, I was thinking about it while you were explaining it, and I was wondering, yeah, all right, I get it. So for my kin, I would like my nephew, I don't have children, but I would like my nephews to do well because they feel like I have a different relationship to them. So, but I was wondering, isn't that sort of a genetic domination strategy, right? So I want my kin to thrive because our gene pool will then succeed. And I sort of had the same cynical thought when I was thinking about the reciprocal altruism, where like, yeah, it's very beneficial to me to have another clan wandering about where I have good relationships with, so I can ally with them, or maybe, well, you know, if they grow, maybe later on I can steal some stuff, right? So once again, it ties back to my own individual survival. Or is there maybe a part of our programming that also has what's best for the species in mind? So no, we would like humankind to survive, something like that.
No, so that okay. The key proponent of the for the good of the species argument was a gentleman by the name of Wynne Edwards, and that, you know, he was pretty much the last guy to propose that, because again, the unit of selection for evolution is the gene. There is no built-in mechanism that says I'm doing this for the good of the species. As a matter of fact, even if you bring it down below below the species level, even the argument that I am doing this for the good of my group, which is known as group selectionism, is an idea that most evolutionary psychologists reject. The living strongest proponent for that mechanism, group selectionism, is a gentleman by the name of David Sloan Wilson. He's an evolutionary biologist at Binghamton University in New York. He was kind enough to invite me to give a couple of talks at his university. I've invited him, so we've known each other for many years. But most evolutionists argue that you only need the eye of the gene in order to be able to explain all phenomena. You don't need to take it to higher levels of selection, whether it be the group or the species. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, a little, but I don't know if I like it, because it's sort of well, it's very, very realistic, almost morbidly so, because I was hoping for a little bit of more nobility in our in our psyche. And this goes back to someone you all also know. We also interviewed Mr. Peterson. And what I like about what Jordan says is he has this whole thing about the hero's journey and the mono myth, which is like our most holy pattern, which he relates to EP. So are you familiar with this?
I mean, look, I'm aware, perhaps not specifically that example, but the idea that archetypes exist and that these archetypes are of their form because of an evolutionary mechanism, I'm perfectly fine with. And of course, many people have thought, well, how come you and Jordan disagree with each other on Jung? Because ultimately Jung was, quote, an evolutionist. The problem with Jung, other than the fact that he's got also a whole bunch of bullshit that's in the occult and mysticism and so on, that's completely not founded in any science. And as a rational scientist, I can't sign up for that. So I'm willing to concede that many of these archetypes exist in their form because it is evolutionary advantageous for us to have held those archetypes. And the classic example that speaks to that, and I guess we could then link it to what Peterson was saying, is if you study the archetype of the male hero in romance novels, right? So we don't need to go into the collective and unconscious and all that bullshit. Just look at current romance novels, right? Again, as someone who studies consumer behavior, I could say, well, can I predict who is the demographic group that reads romance novel? It's almost exclusively women. Well, here's another thing I could tell you is that in every single romance novel that's ever been written, the male hero is the exact same guy. It's as if they plagiarized that one guy. The guy is a prince. Literally, he's royalty. He's also a neurosurgeon. He's also tall. He's also very brash and socially dominant. He also wrestles alligators on his six-pack and kills the alligator by biting him. But he's very gentle and loving to that one female heroine. I just described every single male hero that's ever been written in every romance novel in the history of romance novels. Okay? Well, so that archetype exists precisely for what we talked about earlier, which is fantasies, sexual fantasies exist in their form, have a certain universal pattern because they map onto certain evolutionary preferences. But I don't think there is anything that, there is. So you're thinking that if you describe everything the way that I am, it becomes cynical. You lose some magical element. Evolution doesn't care about sweet stuff. Evolution is simply an incredibly elegant engineering solution to evolutionarily relevant problems. So of course, human beings are noble or can be noble and can be altruistic and can be heroic. But those traits would not have evolved were it not evolutionarily advantageous for them to evolve.
Exactly.
And I'll just mention one other thing. Maimonides, who's a very famous Jewish philosopher who was also a rabbi and who was the physician to the Sultan close to 1,000 years ago. I talk about this actually in this book right here, my first book, The Evolutionary Bases of Consumption, which was the original academic book where I developed the field of evolutionary consumer psychology. I talk in there about a framework that Maimonides had proposed nearly 1,000 years ago. It's going to speak to your idea of cynicism versus nobility. So Maimonides talked about 8 levels of tzedakah. Tzedakah is a Hebrew word that means piety or charity or this pure altruism. And he said that there are 8 levels of this tzedakah, the highest level of which is very, very rare to find. So I'm sorry to now hit you with some more cynicism. The highest form of piety is when the altruist and the benefactor of the altruistic act do not know of each other's identity, and no one else could know their identity. Why is that so rare? Because human beings seldom do things that are so noble and so altruistic that they don't get some benefit out of them. So example, okay, if I now donate to the University of Amsterdam $100 million and I'll call it the anonymous oncology wing. Okay. The reality though, even though it is anonymous, guess what? The people that matter to me in my billionaire club, I'll be sure to tell them that I was the one who donated that money. So therefore, Maimonides, even 1,000 years ago, even though he wasn't couched in the language of evolutionary psychology, was himself a Darwinian being who understood that even as a rabbi, right? So he is certainly steeped in the religious narrative. He recognized that human beings will seldom do things if it doesn't confer them some advantage.
Yes, I understand. And of course, it's, well, I don't think cynical is really the right word, but if you want to tame the beast, you got to understand its nature, right? And human nature is, well, they say we're very irrational decision makers when you look at logic, but there are definitely certain mechanisms that are driving the thing forward. So I'm very curious about the states we can be in because of these modules that, well, basically made sure that we survived. I always find it funny that our body, our brain, our physiology hasn't really accepted the fridge yet. Right. So the fact that we still store fat is actually kind of funny, but it takes so long. So it's good to be aware of these things. You already spoke a little about the Savannah principle. And if I look at people that listen to our podcast, I think they're dealing with a lot in trying to live their life is stress. Obviously, everybody has to deal with stress. But I think that if the average listener did a little checking in with themselves, they would conclude that like maybe 90% of the times you're stressed out about something. This is because you fear someone's evaluation. So there's a fear of negative evaluation going on, which ties in straight back to that Savannah principle. Maybe you could explain that a little so we can maybe understand it better and maybe not give into it so much.
Yeah. So I guess I will link the discussion on stress to something in my forthcoming book. And I'm not doing so to artificially promote the book. It's still a couple of months before it comes out. But this is a book that I wrote to try to use both my personal experiences and my scientific background to offer some new insights about how to live the good life. Now, you might say, well, my God, the ancient Greeks have already said all that there is to be said about the good life. But of course, there are personal anecdotes that are also instructive, and there is new science that is also instructive. So in one of the yes, go ahead.
They didn't have to deal with the internet.
And exactly. They didn't have Twitter nudging you every 2 seconds.
Exactly.
So in one of the chapters, I specifically address stress. So to your point. So in one of the chapters, I talk about the fact that everything in life, I mean, literally, I don't think there is a more powerful law in nature than the inverted U. The inverted U is simply the mathematical, curve of what the ancient Greeks had already said, everything in moderation, right? So Aristotle, and I'm going to come to stress in a second. Go with me on the journey. Okay.
Sure.
Aristotle had said that in his argument, in his ethics treatise, he talked about the golden mean. The idea being that, for example, a soldier who is cowardly is a bad thing. The soldier who is so reckless in his courage that he's going to get killed in 5 seconds is not a good thing. There is some golden mean. So, and now the reason why it's called the inverted U is because too little of something is not good. Too much of something is not good. And somewhere in the middle is the optimal response. So for example, when you're talking about, since you guys deal with well-being, when you're talking about exercise intensity, it turns out that there's tons of research that shows that, too little intensity is not good. Too much intensity in exercise is not good. Somewhere in the middle is. Now let's bring it to stress. Well, Robert Sapolsky, who's a great neurobiologist at Stanford, wrote so before I get to the inverted U of stress, let me just mention a book of his that he wrote probably about 15 years ago. The book was called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And what he was talking about in that there is that zebras are a prey animal. So they have, usually we have either a fight or flight mechanism. They have a flight mechanism, but they don't sit and say, oh my God, my life sucks. Here I am grazing on this African savanna. I'm surrounded by these really nasty predators. They simply go about merely living their lives. And if the lions or the hyenas run after them, they hopefully outrun them. And if they don't, they die. And therefore their cortisol levels they don't have the same pattern that we do, because number one, they don't sit and worry about the past, nor do they worry about the future, whereas we do. And that's why the edict of, live in the moment is so easy to say, but so hard for humans to do. Now, Sapolsky talked about the inverted U for stress, meaning that too little stress is not good, because if you don't, for example, if you have no stress before you're playing in the World Cup final, maybe you don't give a shit about the World Cup final. Then you need to be a bit anxious. I mean, even Lionel Messi throws up before he plays a game. And I mean, what does Lionel Messi have to be nervous about? If you have too much stress, so it becomes debilitating, so that I'm unable to go and do the exam, because the second that I go to write the exam, I pull a blank and I can't remember anything I did. But some intermediate level of stress is perfectly, adaptable, and that's where the optimal functioning happens. Now, of course, it's easy to explain that. The idea is, how do we modulate where that middle point is? Now, there are some behavioral strategies that you can do. So, for example, being someone who's very public, who has a very big platform, it was very easy for me to become entrapped by social media, because I always have something to say. I always have somebody to fight with because they're saying something stupid. But then I said, okay, I can implement a behavioral strategy whereby on the weekend, under no circumstances will I ever check my emails. Well, simply implementing that at least moved me from the bad part of the stress curve and brought me back. So there are, behavioral interventions that we can hopefully implement that allows us to be just at the right point of the stress response curve.
Yes. And the mechanism I was sort of looking for, let's take Twitter, for example, is I think our stress response is triggered mostly by other people's opinions or something happening that will do something that will influence other people's opinions. I made a mistake. Now someone thinks I'm a doofus and I just dropped in status. And this is very stressful to me. Why is this so stressful to me?
Well, because you're exactly right, because we are a social species, and therefore, one of the most dangerous environmental threats are other human beings, right? So unlike other animals where, remember I said, you don't want to become someone's dinner and you want to get enough dinner, we have another element of dangerous minefield, and that is how do we navigate amongst our conspecifics, our members of our species. But by the way, that also explains, and I'll come back in a second to why it's important, but that explains, for example, the evolution of self-deception, which is something that the evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers, who's still alive, by the way, has proposed. And the argument is that the reason why we have an uncanny ability to deceive ourselves is because we need to first deceive ourselves before I'm able to deceive you, right? So we are involved in an evolutionary arms race, you and I. I want to try to get you to manipulate you for my service, and you're trying to pick up whether there are any cues that I am letting out that suggest that I'm trying to manipulate you. And so we're involved in this evolutionary arms race. Well, one of the ways that I ensure that I don't emit any micro signatures that I may be manipulating you or lying to you is if I can shut off those micro cues. How do I shut off those micro cues? Is by this self-deceiving myself. So again, it shows you the brilliance of evolutionary theory, because it always asks the ultimate why. Why did we evolve this ability or this pattern of thinking or this behavioral pattern? So then to come back to your issue of, stress being related to social comparison and what others think of us, there's great research, for example, that shows that, contrary to what social constructivists say, women don't actually feel bad when they are compared to images of supermodels, right? The argument is that the reason why women oftentimes feel bad about themselves is because they're constantly bombarded with images of beautiful women, then that makes them feel bad about themselves. And actually, the research shows that that's not true. What is true, and the reason why it doesn't happen is because that supermodel is actually a genetic mutant. I could disregard her as someone that's relevant to my daily life. On the other hand, if I'm a woman and within my social network, there is a beautiful woman that is now monopolizing the attention of all the men in my social group, now I'm pissed because that woman is truly a threat to me. Or if, let's put it the other way, if I'm a man, I'm not so intimidated by the fact that you have nicer shoulders than I do, Michael. But if you have higher status than me, now I'm pissed. Now Michael needs to die, metaphorically speaking. Right? And so of course, everything that we do is driven by these social comparisons. And I'll give you another great example, actually, from my own research. So I did research with one of my former doctoral students, published in an economics journal, where we looked at the following two scenarios. It's going to speak exactly to your social comparison mechanism and how that causes us stress. If I tell you one of two scenarios, I'm going to give you a $500, weekly salary increase, and I'm going to give your coworker a $500 salary increase. So you both get $500. Or I'm going to give you a $600 increase, and I'm going to give your coworker an $800 increase. Now, from a strict axiom of rational choice, as economists would think, people should pick the $600 one, because $600 is more money in my pocket than $500. And therefore, using the axiom of income maximization, I should prefer the 600 and 800. But of course, people don't choose that. People prefer that I get 500 and my coworker gets 500 rather than me get 600 and that asshole getting 800. And so that speaks to the point that positional arms race is very, and by the way, positional arms race drives much of the economy. So for example, and this, by the way, I talk about in this book quite a bit. So, so the idea keeping up with the Joneses, that speaks to conspicuous consumption, right? Look at those asshole neighbors of ours showing off with their Porsche. I'm going to show those assholes. I'm going to buy a better car. So positional envy is a driving engine of the economy.
Yeah. So I have a few things popping into my mind. The first thing I'm curious about is why, because I recognize completely the dynamic that you mentioned, keeping up with Joneses. I get that from an individual level, right? So if I'm trying to do sexual selection, it's good to be higher in a hierarchy, so I get noticed and I seem like a competent guy that can ensure resources. Sure, I get that. But why is it so important for a family living in the street to outcompete the family next door? It doesn't seem to serve any evolutionary purpose, or is it? Well, maybe you can explain that.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, off the top of my head, I'd have to think more about your example, but I'm going to link here to a theory called Trivers Willard hypothesis. It's the same Trivers as the one from the evolution of self-deception. But I should mention to your viewers and listeners that this theory hasn't received the kind of validation, the empirical validation that you otherwise might expect. So it's still being debated, but it's going to speak to the question that you asked. So Trivers Willard hypothesis explains why parental favoritism would evolve, so that can I predict under which conditions parents invest more in their son versus invest more in their daughter. Now, from a strict genetic relatedness perspective, you would expect that there should be no difference because I am just as genetically related to my son as I am to my daughter. So you would expect no differences. And yet what the Trivers Willard hypothesis proposes, and some data has found, is that when my status, the parental status, is high, then we channel much more our parental favoritism and our investment to our sons. When our status is low, we channel it much more to our daughter. Now, why is that? And this might relate to your original question, because to the extent that status could be passed on, and to the extent that the variability in reproductive fitness is greater in men as a function of their status, right? If I am very, very high status, if I'm the Sultan, I can get access to 800 women, whereas a whole bunch of other men sit around twiddling their thumbs in celibate frustration. Whereas most women, irrespective of their mating value, will end up having roughly the same reproductive fitness because they are bound by their reproductive capacity. So the variance in women's fitness is much lesser than the variance in men's fitness. So I suspect that the question that you were asking is that the reason why we may still wish to signal to the neighbors that we are high status or not, because there is value in that signal, whether it be because we are demonstrating how status our son has or whatever. So I could easily construct a sexual signaling argument for why what you asked would happen.
So maybe it's a strategy to enhance sexual selection for your offspring.
Exactly.
Exactly. Right.
And in a sense, by the way, and to that point, in many societies, you are passing on the mate choice in an arranged marriage to the parents. Right? So it's no longer the individual who is choosing whom he or she is going to marry, but even that, to your point, is simply moving the evolutionary mechanisms from the people who are getting married to their parents. That's all you're doing, right? Nothing else is changing, right? So the parents are not saying, if they have a daughter, we would love for her. Can anybody find us a guy who's completely unambitious and is an absolute certified loser? Because that's who we want to assign for our beautiful daughter. So nothing is changing. It's just the person who is instantiating the sexual selection that's changing.
All right. That's more clear. Thank you. I have one more question, because I think your original hunch that 4 hours was going to be on the too little time side is right. So you spoke about your new book,
Yes.
about living a good life.
Yes.
You spoke a little bit about stress already. Can you give us a little glimpse behind the curtain what other topics you're going to be addressing in that book?
Right. So just to kind of contextualize that book compared to this book, The Parasitic Mind. The Parasitic Mind is about what happens to human minds when they are parasitized by bad ideas, what I call idea pathogens. So in the same way that an actual brainworm could parasitize an animal, causing it to behave in maladaptive ways in order to advance its own selfish purpose from the perspective of the parasite. Well, I argue, of course, that human minds could be parasitized by bad ideas, postmodernism, militant feminism, social constructivism, biophobia, cultural relativism. And so in the book, I talk about where these ideas originate and how we can develop a mind vaccine against these bad ideas. Now, the reason why I mentioned that book compared to the upcoming book, that book talks about the mind being parasitized by bad ideas. In the next book, I said, okay, well, let me get out of the negative part of the human mind and let me look for the winning mindsets that we can hold that hopefully increase the likelihood of us living happy lives. And so to your question now, I'll answer a few of these. So I already mentioned the fact that much of optimal functioning at any level of analysis operates under the inverted U curve. And so I have a whole chapter where I talk about the importance of this moderation argument, whether it be in how we exercise, how much stress we experience, how creative, it's endless domains. You always see this inverted U shape. In one of the chapters, I talk about the two most fundamental decisions that either will impart huge happiness to you or great misery. And these two decisions are choosing the right spouse and choosing the right profession. Now, and of course, the answer is very simple. If I wake up every day and I go to bed every day next to a person that I really appreciate, I'm well on my way to ascending Mount Happiness. And then if in between that, I'm in a job that brings me great purpose and meaning, then I've cracked the code. Then now, of course, there is no magic recipe for how you ensure that you found the right mate and that you found the right choice. But there are certainly certain key markers that I can look for that either augment or reduce. So again, unlike many quote self-help books that promise you that here are the 6 steps to reverse aging. Here are the 7 steps to ensure that every time you make love, your wife has multiple orgasms. That's called bullshit. Okay. Yes. So in this book, I'm actually quite epistemologically humble. What I'm saying is, what I can assure you is that here are some guidelines which, if you implement, increase the probability of you achieving, reaching Mount Happiness. So an example of a professional choice that you make that might increase your chance of achieving purpose and meaning, I argue that anything that you do that substantiates or instantiates your creative impulse will be more likely to offer you purpose and meaning. So creative could be, if I'm a chef, I create something from scratch. If I'm an architect, I create something. That beautiful building didn't exist until I came along. I, as an author, as a professor, I create things. When someone sends me a photo of them sitting on the beach in Abu Dhabi reading my book, I get a great sense of purpose and meaning. Not because I'm an ego-driven guy, not because it's narcissism, but because I've created something that has added to the pantheon of the human experience. So it doesn't have to be that you become a famous professor but as long as you are involved in something creative, then I think you're well on your way to having greater likelihood of having purpose and meaning. Do you want me to mention one or two other? Yeah, things? Sure. I'm fascinated. Yes, by all means. So also in the book, I have in one of the almost towards the end of the book, I have a chapter where I talk about, a life well lived is one where you kind of look back and hopefully have as few regrets as possible. And there I talk about a theory from one of my former psychology professors when I was doing my PhD at Cornell. His name is Tom Gilovich, and he pioneered the psychology of regret in the following sense. He argued that there are two fundamental sources of regret that people experience. There is regret due to action and regret due to inaction. So regret due to action would be, I really regret that I cheated on my wife. That ended our marriage and I was such an asshole. I regret so much having that. I made an action, which I now regret. Regret due to inaction, which kind of speaks to hunting for the right job. Regret due to inaction is when you say, I regret that I never pursued my love for art. I became an accountant because my dad was an accountant and he thought it was a safe thing for me to study. And I regret that I never instantiated my love for art. Now, it turns out, Michael, that over the long term, the greatest source of regret that people experience is regret due to inaction rather than action, right? I regret that I never went to Amsterdam and pursued my soccer career with Ajax. Okay. Yes. So in that chapter, I then talk about, so what are some things that we can do to hopefully be sitting at that porch when we're 85 and look back at our life, and hopefully we're all going to have some regrets, but how is there a path by which we can minimize the amount of regrets? And so in each of these chapters, I have some kind of fundamental rule, seek variety, live life as a playground. So that these are all different chapters. So one of the chapters I talk about is that everything in life should be tackled through play. So even in my scientific career, the pursuit of science is a form of play, right? Because you're taking a puzzle, you're taking variables that you didn't know were connected, and now you're building that puzzle. So you should approach science, even something as serious as science, with wide-eyed, childlike awe. The reason why, for example, if you follow me, Michael, or if some of your followers follow me, even though I can be very professorial as I have been on this chat, I can also be a complete joker, a complete buffoon. Not buffoon, but I can hide under the desk pretending that I am scared. I can self-flagellate myself. Now, why is it that I'm the only professor who does that? Well, because I recognize that human beings are multifaceted beings, that I don't have to only live by the archetype of the fancy, haughty professor, because I'm also a funny guy. I'm fun. I'm joyful. I'm happy. I joke around. And that doesn't in any way cause any detriment to when I need to be austere and professorial. So live life as a playground. Have fun. I don't need to have done this chat with you, but guess what? I was enriched by it. I met a new person. Maybe some people in the Netherlands are going to find out about some of the cool things that I do. So I approach every single situation without any careerist impulse, but rather with just life is an oyster, get out there, have fun. And so I go through the whole book, and hopefully it will be a huge success.
Well, first off, I like what you said about not pinning yourself down in one certain identity. I always forget the guy who said this, but be careful who you pretend to be, because you become who you pretend to be. So yeah, make sure you add fun to that as well, because life is short. So I like that. And yes, thank you for enriching our audience on this topic. And I would already like to extend an invitation for when your new book is due, then I would love to hear more on this, and I'm sure our audience would as well. For now, I would like to thank you for your time and your energy. I had a blast, so thanks a lot. And everyone else listening, see you next time. Ciao.
Thank you, Michael. Cheers.
Cheers.